Key macroeconomic statistics, output, and productivity. Welcome to our fifth topic in this course, which also is the third discussion of the three key economic concepts to assess the performance of the economy. The reason that output and productivity are in the title is that the two measures are related, which we will discuss shortly. Please read Chapter 5 in the textbook. Note that as of September 28, 2023, the reference year for real gross domestic product was updated from 2012 to 2017. So, the references in the book to 2012 should be thought of as 2017 now. Base years are arbitrary. In this topic, you will learn about measures of economic output and related concepts. You will learn 1. What gross domestic product, GDP, is. 2. How gross domestic product is measured. 3. What inflation-adjusted GDP represents. 4. How gross domestic product is analyzed. 5. The theoretical concept of GDP, known as natural or potential GDP. 6. The limitations of GDP. 7. How GDP is related to productivity. 8. The drivers of economic growth. 9. How international productivity compares. In the reader notes, there was a reference to the British study entitled Public Understanding of Economics and Economic Statistics, published in November 2020, which found that, quote, less than half of the British public are able to correctly identify the definition of GDP from a list of options, and that the vast majority demonstrated little to no understanding about the size of GDP growth rates, and did not typically understand what was meant when economic indicators were reported as a proportion of GDP. In fact, GDP was seen as economic jargon, contributing to the feeling that economics was largely inaccessible to them. Unquote. As we noted earlier, this study is probably representative of the public's understanding of key statistics in most industrialized countries, such as the United States. As such, one of the goals of this topic is to acquaint you with the GDP concepts of output and income. Let's begin. The starting point is to ask the basic question: how is the economy's performance assessed? Although there may be many narrow and expansive ways to answer that question, typically nations measure economic performance based on the country's real gross domestic product. The adjective used here, real, will be explained shortly, but its reference is to inflation-adjusted output. The U.S. Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA, is the governmental agency that compiles the GDP statistics for the U.S. economy. Although those statistics are quarterly, the BEA updates its tally of GDP every month as more and revised economic data are tallied by the BEA and other statistical agencies of government. The first estimate of the previous quarter's GDP is designated as the advance release. The second estimate of the previous quarter's GDP is designated as the second estimate, as the name would imply. And the third estimate of the previous quarter's GDP is designated as the third or final estimate. But final is not really final since there are annual revisions as more complete data is tallied for the past year. On this slide is the growth rate for real GDP. For this presentation, the BEA expresses quarterly growth rates of real GDP and its components at annual or compound rates for ease of comparisons with annual historical data. To calculate the annualized quarterly growth rates, the period-to-period change is raised to the exponent power of 4, which represents the frequency of the data. An example of that calculation is shown with the data substitution for the first quarter of 2024. Be sure that you understand the calculation. For additional discussion about growth rates, please read question 213 in Chapter 7. Although we will delve into Chapter 7 shortly, Growth rates are an important issue in how we see the economy's performance. For now, we will just focus on the annualized growth rate, since it is part of the reporting for real GDP and its components. Why is the gross domestic product such an important statistic? There are a lot of reasons why gross domestic product, or GDP, has become an important statistic for measuring an economy's performance. Some of the reasons include: 1. GDP provides the most comprehensive measurement of the economic health of the economy. 2. GDP represents the nation's output. 3. GDP measures the value of goods and services produced in the economy. However, GDP only measures final demand, so that it does not double count the value of intermediate production and raw materials. Final demand is just under 60% of total production, known as gross output. So, gross output for the U.S. economy equals final demand, which is the value added to the production process, without double counting for intermediate and raw material output, plus the output of intermediate inputs that feed into the final demand production. As noted on the slide, intermediate inputs equal energy inputs plus materials inputs plus purchase services inputs. The late purchasing management professor John Hoagland, of Michigan State University, was a big proponent of saying that GDP does not represent the true size of the U.S. economy. He was correct, especially from the standpoint of understanding the purchasing flows in the economy. John argued that gross output, which included double counting, was the more important metric to track orders and inventories, which were of significance to corporate purchasing managers. Nonetheless, from the economist's standpoint, final demand is the key metric for understanding the economy's performance. What is the difference between U.S. GDP, measured in market prices versus in 2017 dollars or constant dollars? Market valued or nominal GDP is the nation's value, that is, aggregate price, multiplied by aggregate quantity of all currently produced goods and services, or final demand, sold on the market during a particular time interval. Real GDP, measured in an arbitrary base period of 2017 dollars, is nominal GDP adjusted to remove the impact of inflation, or conceptually, just the aggregate quantity. Let me stress the interchangeable terms that are used for each of these concepts. GDP could be referred to as nominal GDP, GDP at market prices, or current dollar GDP. GDP adjusted to remove the effects of inflation could be referred to as real GDP, inflation-adjusted GDP, or GDP in constant dollars. As noted earlier, for example, real GDP for the U.S. was updated to a 2017 reference year from 2012, as of September 28, 2023, when the BEA released their annual benchmark update to GDP to capture more complete source data used in its calculations. Before going further in this discussion, let's think about the structure of our economy as having two parts. 1. The price sector, and 2. The real sector. If we designated the price sector as P, and the real sector as Q, then P, multiplied by Q, represents nominal GDP. If, however, we are considering only the real sector, that is simply the Q, which is represented by real GDP. So far, our discussion is only about the actual data that is tallied by the U.S. Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis. But we need to ask, is there a theoretical counterpart for actual GDP? Yes. The theoretical counterpart of actual GDP is natural GDP, or more commonly referred to as potential GDP. Potential GDP is considered an economic goal for policymakers to achieve. Although most textbooks like to refer to the concept of natural GDP, it is more conceptually understood as potential output, or GDP at full employment. Identical to the actual GDP data, there are two forms of the potential or natural GDP measures. Natural nominal GDP, also known as potential nominal GDP, is the level of current dollar GDP, where the economy is at full resource use and there is no tendency for inflation to rise or fall. Natural real GDP, also known as potential real GDP, is the level of real GDP, which is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office, where the economy is at full resource use and there is no tendency for inflation to rise or fall. What is trend real GDP growth? From an empirical standpoint, a specific growth rate could be calculated over a long period or some reference period as the trend growth rate in the economy. However, the trend real GDP is also thought of as the growth rate in real potential, or natural, GDP, because that estimate of potential is based on estimates of current trend growth in the labor force, productivity, and so forth. So, potential GDP is akin to the trend in real GDP. How is inflation adjusted or real GDP measured? Of course, we have mentioned this earlier, but the BEA estimates nominal GDP and the price level separately, and from those measures can calculate real GDP. Although this might be slightly redundant from an earlier slide, hopefully, it drives home the relationship. Why are shares of GDP always shown in current dollar prices? This is not something that you may have thought about, but it is an important analytical point. The expenditure share of the economy is by definition the price multiplied by the quantity of that slice of the economy, divided by the total expenditure, price multiplied by quantity. If you remove the price component, then you no longer have an expenditure share of the total. Therefore, expenditure shares are always derived as a share of nominal or current dollar spending. Remember, earlier we looked at what went into GDP, and one component was investment. This raises the question, does the GDP measure of investment include the purchase of stocks and bonds? The answer is a resounding no. Investment in GDP measures the purchase of physical assets, such as new machines, new houses, or the change in the value of business inventories. Of course, stocks and bonds might be part of wealth, but GDP does not measure wealth. It measures current production or output. Does GDP measure the standard of living in a nation? Yes. However, comparisons of the level of GDP between nations must be adjusted for a common currency, at a minimum, and a common set of international prices, ideally. When the level of GDP for different nations is adjusted by both a common currency and a common set of international prices, this adjustment is known as purchasing power parity, or PPP. The idea behind the purchasing power parity of GDP is that it is adjusted by a price index for a nation based upon a common international market basket of goods and services, not just a local basket, and then is additionally adjusted for differences in exchange rates globally. The simple alternative to the purchasing power parity adjustment is to use just market exchange rates to adjust a country's GDP. But those are bilateral exchange rates, may not represent internationally traded goods and services, while the purchasing power parity tries to measure the purchasing power of consumers across different countries. Thus, the purchasing power parity, PPP, exchange rate is the rate at which the currency of one country would have to be converted into that of another country to buy the same amount of goods and services in each country. The IMF, which calculates a measure of PPP, wrote that to understand PPP, let's take a commonly used example: the price of a hamburger. If a hamburger is selling in London for £2 and in New York for $4, This would imply a PPP exchange rate of £1 to $2. This PPP exchange rate may well be different from that prevailing in financial markets, which means that the actual dollar cost of a hamburger in London may be either more or less than the $4 it sells for in New York. This type of cross-country comparison is the basis for the well-known Big Mac Index, which is published by The Economist magazine, and calculates PPP exchange rates based on the McDonald's hamburger that sells in nearly identical form in many countries around the world. However, what is done is to use a market basket of goods and services that allow for price comparisons across countries and a wide range of goods and services. To facilitate price comparisons across countries, the International Comparisons Program, ICP, was established by the United Nations and the University of Pennsylvania in 1968. PPPs generated by the ICP are based on a global survey of prices, which defines the market basket. Although conceptually the IMF, and many economists, would argue PPP is conceptually better than using a single country's currency to compare output across the nations of the globe, PPP has some critics who argue it is metric that is hard to measure and can introduce inaccuracies into the measurement. Nonetheless, it is used by international organizations, such as the World Bank, to compare output by nation. What is the largest economy in the world, measured in terms of GDP using purchasing power parity? Determining the global share of the world economy can be a tricky endeavor, even using internationally comparable estimates of GDP, expressed in purchasing power parity or PPP terms. The World Bank calculates those data in various ways. How should this comparison be made? The World Bank recommends the use of current dollar GDP in PPP terms for spatial comparison, that is, across geography for cross-country comparisons. But to assess the size of an economy over time, to use constant dollar GDP. Nonetheless, from a practical perspective, the shares of world GDP with either measure on this slide will be approximately the same. Moreover, the international organization also warns that its PPP measures cannot provide a truly precise or strict ranking or size of economies. In other words, it is the best they can offer, but the user should be careful in over-interpreting the data. According to the World Bank's estimates, based on the purchasing power parity concept, China accounted for 18.2% of world GDP in 2022, followed by the United States at 15.3%. To complicate matters, the World Bank also provides estimates of world GDP in US dollars, both nominal and real. Based on the nominal shares of world GDP in US dollars, the relative standing of the US economy is quite different. In US dollars, the United States economy ranks as the largest in the world, garnering 23.3% of world output in 2022, followed by China at 18.1%. So, which perspective is more accurate for understanding the global standard of living? Some people challenge the validity of this World Bank measurement based on the PPP. For example, an article by Ruchir Sharma, entitled, "China's economy will not overtake the US until 2060, if ever," which appeared in the Financial Times on October 23, 2022, was critical of the World Bank's calculation on a PPP basis. The commentator opined that, quote, by 2014, some economists were claiming that China already was the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity, a construct based on theoretical currency values with no meaning in the real world, unquote. Although the PPP concept may be theoretically preferable, another concern with the use of the concept is based on the validity or accuracy of input data, especially Chinese statistics. In a U.S. State Department cable released by WikiLeaks, China's former Premier Li Keqiang was quoted telling diplomats that Chinese economic growth statistics were man-made, and saying he looked instead to electricity demand, rail cargo traffic, and lending as more accurate indicators. This has long been a concern of some analysts, as well. A former BLS commissioner, Janet Norwood, once noted that the problem with Chinese statistics is that planned numbers are used as the actual. Consequently, more often than not, journalists continue to refer to China's economy as the second largest in the world, following the United States. Even aside from how international economies might be compared, there is a more fundamental question about the limitations of GDP, and consequently as a measure of the nation's standard of living. GDP does not cover every aspect of the economy and life, unless there is some measured transaction associated with production. Therefore, GDP does not capture the underground economy where transactions are not recorded. It does not cover what is called household production. That is, unpaid family members providing childcare and other services. It does not include the value to people of leisure time, and it does not capture environmental quality. There is no adjustment in GDP for the quality of life, including health and life expectancy, political freedom, or social justice. Although GDP may be a broad-based measure of the economy's living standard, it is not perfect. Few statistics are, which is why they are continually being assessed conceptually and improved, if possible. What types of economic statistics can address some of the limitations of GDP? There are numerous statistics that measure economic, social, and demographic trends. Some examples of broader or analytical metrics are the Gini index, which measures the extent to which the distribution of income, or, in some cases, consumption expenditure, among individuals or households within an economy deviates from a perfectly equal distribution. The Human Capital Index, HCI, calculates the contributions of health and education to worker productivity. These examples are just the tip of a statistical iceberg of additional statistics, which can include environmental statistics, including work on environmental economic accounting, crime statistics, health statistics, and more, to supplement and address the limitations of GDP. Let's return to the U.S. statistics for real GDP and real potential GDP. What is the theoretical relationship between real GDP and real potential, or natural, GDP? The relationship between real GDP and real potential GDP is effectively the same as between measures of cyclical growth and trend growth in the economy. Much like the natural unemployment rate compared with the actual unemployment rate, real potential GDP statistically removes the effect of the business cycle on output, while actual real GDP incorporates the business cycle impacts. Now, taking the difference between actual real GDP and real potential GDP, divided by real potential GDP, and expressed as a percent by multiplying by 100, yields what is known as the GDP or output gap. This gap has theoretical implications for the economy. When the output gap is negative, that implies there is slack in the economy, which in turn implies downward pressure on the inflation rate, downward pressure on interest rates, and upward pressure on the unemployment rate. When the output gap is positive, that implies strong demand in the economy, which in turn implies upward pressure on the inflation rate, upward pressure on interest rates, and downward pressure on the unemployment rate. When the output gap is equal to zero, then the economy is at full employment output, where there is no slack in the economy. Inflation is steady. The actual unemployment rate equals its full unemployment rate, and interest rates are well balanced, neither putting upward nor downward pressure on economic growth. As you can see, economists weave together logical economic relationships when there is excess aggregate demand, that is an output gap that is positive, or when there is excess aggregate supply, or insufficient aggregate demand. We will revisit these relationships when we package these simple stories or theories into the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model in Chapter 8. Earlier we noted that real GDP is considered a current production concept. Also, as we discussed earlier, that current production concept is embodied in an aggregate production function, which says various inputs, such as labor and capital, will generate a certain amount of output. Then a certain amount of an input, for example, labor, allows us to assess efficiency of the production process by measuring the output per unit of labor, or any input. This then leads us to ask, what is productivity and how is it related to real GDP? Productivity has been measured by different formulas, but essentially as output or real GDP, or some slice of real GDP, such as non-farm output, divided by some factor that normalizes the relationship. That output measure could be divided by the number of people, or the number of hours worked. Productivity is based on an aggregate production function for the nation. Then productivity, which is that measure of productive efficiency, is calculated as output divided by some input. Let's be very clear about what is meant by an aggregate production function. The aggregate production function measures a country's production or output. It is the process whereby an economy, as a whole, turns economic inputs, such as human capital, physical capital, and technology into output, and is typically measured as GDP per capita or per hour. So output or real GDP, for example, is a function of the inputs of labor, capital, and technology as shown on this slide. Then any ratio of output, divided by an input provides a measure of productivity, or if the ratio is output divided by a set of inputs, then that is known as multi-factor productivity, or total factor productivity. Although it is common to introduce the production function as dependent on just capital and labor, an expanded set of inputs would include labor, capital, energy, materials, and purchased services. When is real GDP used and when is productivity used in economic theory and analysis? Typically, if we are looking at short-term behavior of the economy, real GDP will be the focus. However, if we are looking at the long-term behavior of the economy, that could be shaped by changes in efficiency, then productivity measures would be the focus. Obviously, productivity draws attention to the inputs, while real GDP is concerned with the amount of output. However, both measures are tied conceptually to the production function. What measures of productivity are used? On a quarterly basis, the BLS produces labor productivity, which measures output relative to hours worked. That is, focusing only on the labor input. On an annual basis, the BLS compiles a measure of total factor productivity by major industries. A related concept to productivity is capital deepening. What is capital deepening? Capital deepening means that the amount of capital per person increases. This concept can apply to both physical capital deepening, which is the more common application, and human capital deepening. Physical capital deepening is generally measured as an increase in the capital to labor ratio. Human capital deepening, or sometimes referred as improvement in labor quality, is increased when the skill level of the workforce is elevated through training and education. Over the years, economists, especially the late Edward Denison, provided influential research on what was termed growth accounting for the economy. Denison's work, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, attempted to explain the decline in U.S. productivity, after much stronger productivity, in the post-World War II period. The chart of this slide shows 10-year average annual growth in U.S. labor productivity. Notice that productivity in the 2010 to 2019 period was especially weak after an improving trend in the first 10 years of the 2000s. Historically, weak productivity was associated with increased price pressures and vice versa. Again, this is a simple story that ties productivity and inflation together. What are the primary causes of change in productivity? The key causes of productivity change are 1. Factor price change, especially energy prices. 2. Workforce demographic change. For example, as the post-World War II baby boom generation entered the workforce in early 1970s, that caused an influx of low productivity workers, since they were relatively inexperienced. And by the early 2000s that demographic group began retiring, which caused these now high productivity workers to be lost from the workforce. 3. Shifts in the use and intensity of capital. This is capital deepening, that is, an increase in the ratio of capital investment to labor. And 4. Changes in technology. Productivity is important when we look to compare economies around the globe. So, what accounts for differences in economic growth in nations? The economy's ability to leverage its factors of production, labor, capital, and technology will determine the nation's economic growth. Since we are focused on the long-run dynamic of the economy, how does long-run growth take place? One answer to that question is by former Federal Reserve Board Chairman Alan Greenspan and Adrian Woolridge, who suggest three factors explain long-term economic growth: productivity, creative destruction, and politics. The first and third factors should be clear to you. But creative destruction is a concept that Harvard economist Joseph Schumpeter described in his 1942 book Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy as a positive force that drives weaker companies to disappear and be replaced by more innovative ones. Although there are numerous examples of industries that face creative destruction, the growth of e-commerce is a prime example of how the traditional retail industry with physical stores faced a new challenge from online retailers, such as an Amazon, which ultimately has remade the retail industry. You can probably name other technologies that are reshaping industries, from the motor vehicle industry facing new electric vehicles, to the news and entertainment media, to the financial services industry, to name just a few. In a much earlier time, about 100 years ago, Henry Ford's assembly line was an example of a technology that revolutionized the automotive industry. As we think about international trade and economic growth, we ask, what is international economic convergence? Economic convergence is defined as the pattern where economies with low per capita incomes, real GDP per capita, grow faster than economies with high per capita income, so that per capita incomes converge to nearly identical levels across countries. But how realistic is that? With greater communication and technology sharing among nations, is it likely that nations of the world will see their economic growth rates converge? Practically, convergence is unlikely anytime soon, because the income gap is almost insurmountable, with high-income countries' national income better than 26 times as large as the low-income countries in 2022, while high-income countries' national income was greater than 4 times as large as the middle-income countries. This slide shows the relative size difference between high-income, middle-income, and low-income countries for gross national income per capita, measured in inflation-adjusted purchasing power parity international dollars. Hence, even if economic convergence consistently and, over the long term, could accelerate economic growth faster for the middle and low-income countries than the high-income countries, there is a wide gap to catch up. Over the 2010 to 2022 years, high-income countries' income per capita increased by 1.5% per year, while the middle-income countries' income per capita increased by 3.5% per year, and the low-income countries' per capita increased by 1.1% per year. It is a tough hurdle, both with arithmetic and conceptually with newer technologies, that will likely keep a gap between the high and low-income countries' standards of living. This concludes the discussion on the third and final key statistic for the economy. This does not mean that there are not other important economic indicators to understand the economy. But those three measures, employment, inflation, and output, are key to policy goals for the economy. Finally, consider these questions to help you further understand output and productivity measures.